Hello, everybody. Welcome to the post-screening conversation for Poly Styrene, I Am A Cliché. So I am so excited. We have the co-director of Poly Styrene, I Am A Cliché with us, Celeste Bell, who is also an incredible educator, artist, performer, singer, writer, and keeper of the flame of all things polystyrene and polystyrene's daughter. So it is such an honor and it's so excited to be able to talk to her. Let's welcome her to the stage. Celeste Bell is joining us now. Yay. Hi, Celeste.
Hi, Jessica. Thank you. Thanks for the intro.
Oh yeah, thank you so much for doing this. So grateful, and wow, where to start? Well, I mean, first of all, let me just say, and as our audience knows because they've just watched the film, it's just phenomenal. I am a huge polystyrene fan, have been for years, like so many people you've probably met and known. And it's just such an incredible tribute to her. It's so complex. I think it really gets into some themes that are actually really prevalent in a lot of artists' lives that I don't actually see explored a lot in these kind of stories and these kind of films. And I want to talk about that a little bit. And it's just, thank you, thank you, thank you. First off, it's just so special, and you did such a wonderful job. And it's just, I mean, how do you even pay tribute to somebody like your mom? And like, you did it, you know what I mean? And you did it so beautifully and effectively, and it honors her so well. So first off, just thank you for that. It just means a lot to me. She always, meant a lot to me as a, BIPOC woman that got into alternative culture early, that is also mixed race. And I'm sure you've heard that a lot too, just, what your mom represents to women, for women like me, and for everybody really. So let's go back a little bit. So like, how did this film happen? How did it, and you have a co-director, Paul Sneg, right? Is his
Paul Sung.
Paul Sung, that's his. Okay, I want to make
Yeah,
sure I
it's
pronounce
like
his name right.
it's
Paul Sung, yeah.
SNG.
Okay,
Yeah.
Paul Sung is a correct pronunciation. Yeah. So, how did you and Paul Sung come to collaborate on this project, and how did this all happen and get started? And please
Yeah.
share.
Well, the genesis of the project was really a book, which I started co-writing with Zoe Howe, who's quite a prolific music writer. She's written many biographies, including the Slits biography and Stevie Nicks and Wilco Johnson, so many interesting artists. And she actually interviewed me for a book about 15 years ago. And this was a book about the children of, famous, let's say, musicians. It was called How's Your Dad? Living in the Shadow of a Rock Star Parent.
Mm.
So we actually met backstage. I think it was, back in sort of 2008. And she interviewed me, and then we kept in touch. So about 5 years ago, well, actually 6 years ago now, I started the process of going through my mother's archive. And you see that in the film. I'm sort of unpacking the boxes. And sort of during that process, I just was really impressed with what I was discovering in terms of my mum's visual artwork. So I thought it would be really good to put a book together, like a coffee table art book, to showcase the artwork. And she'd also written these diary entries retrospectively. So in the early 2000s, my mother wrote a collection of diary entries. She called it Diary of the 70s. And it was looking back at her time in X-Ray Specs, specifically looking at the album Germ-Free Adolescence. And she wrote a diary entry for each track on the album. And, really wonderful writing. My mum was a fantastic writer. I think, she had many talents, but writing was really, one of her strongest talents. So I thought, the world needed to see this, they needed to read this, and they needed to see her visual artwork. So that was sort of the beginning of everything. And then it just all kind of mushroomed very quickly into something bigger and more extensive. So, the book turned into something more biographical. And then very quickly after starting on the book, Zoe introduced me to Paul Sung, who was really keen to do a film with us, sort of based around the book. So it just kind of, it was like a domino effect after that. And, before I knew it, I was co-directing a film as well as co-authoring a book.
And that book is called Dayglow, correct?
Dayglow, yeah. So that's Dayglow, the Poly Styrene story. And, we were thinking maybe to have the same name for the book and the film, but really they are two, obviously very connected, the two projects. Zoe also was a writer on the film as well, co-writer. So I was co-writer on the film and the book with Zoe, and co-director with Paul. So it was the three of us, but we felt like both the book and the film deserve their own names because they are quite different projects, even though they're connected, obviously, because they're both based on my mother's life and work.
Yeah, and as you said, I mean, we're talking about the work of an incredible writer, so it makes sense that the titles are so literate and playful. And I mean, the title of the movie is like one of the greats. I love that you went with a different title, and it's such a perfect title, and it's so wonderful. And yeah, along those lines, I just wanted to mention that one of the Houston Cinema Arts Society's board members is Michael Zilka, who co-founded ZE Records, which was like a no-wave kind of post-punk label in New York. And when I mentioned that we were doing this, he mentioned that he knew your mom. And the first thing he said was she was the best writer. Yeah. She was such an incredible writer.
Yeah.
And, it's so true. And also just so prescient. And I think, you've talked about that in other interviews. And I mean, could you expand? I mean, I have my own ideas about that, but I'm just curious, like, about your perspective, in terms of this idea that, like, what she was talking about is more relevant than ever, and just how prescient she was then and now, and just how forward thinking she was. And could you talk a little bit about that and your thoughts about that, and why her perspective, is so relevant today?
Yeah. I think my mother had an uncanny ability to, predict things, to predict trends, and she kind of had her finger on the button in terms of, what was starting to emerge in society. And I think that was just because my mother was extremely sensitive and very perceptive. That was... as I said before, she was a woman of many talents, but I would say her foresight and just her ability to gauge, the undercurrents of what was kind of happening, things that maybe people at the time weren't really focused on or weren't really aware of, but she was able to pick up on these things, and then she was kind of able to see where they were going to lead, So this is a real... a very special skill she had. She would have been a great, trend forecaster or something like that. And some of the things that were just starting to be talked about in the early 70s, but sort of on the fringes, were things like, so certain scientific advances, like genetic engineering, and she would have read about that in a magazine, and that kind of was like inspired a lot of her lyrical output, because a lot of Germ for Adolescence is this kind of sci-fi, utopian, dystopian kind of themed songs. So Genetic Engineering, The Day the World Turned Dayglow. She was very interested in consumerism, because again, the 70s was actually the time when the first like big supermarkets were kind of cropping up all over the place, and that everyone had for the first time a color television. If you were lucky enough, a lot of people still have black and white TVs, but there was the color television, there was the advertisements all over the place starting to crop up. Now we take these things for granted because I was born with this stuff, so it's strange for me to think to put myself in the place of my mother, who she grew up seeing these things, not having all of this stuff, and then seeing it emerge. And that was a big inspiration for her. And I think what she was able to do was just to take in what was happening at the time and accurately kind of predict where it was going to take us much later. You know, so I think she really belongs. Obviously, she was a musician and a performer, but her writing, you know, we could put her alongside, you know, people like Aldous Huxley, you know, and George Orwell, in terms of, you know, she was really thinking about dystopia and utopia and futurism. And I think that really that was a big sort of driving force in her creativity.
Totally. And then, I mean, I would say also, you know, we could put her beside, which is interesting to think about, Afrofuturists.
Yeah.
And people like Octavia Butler, and that she was also representing that, you know, kind of in an earlier point. And now there's this understanding in the culture of kind of like Afrofuturism for all of us, right? Because Afrofuturism is sounding the alarm, you know, around depression, right? And not just of Black people, but of all of us, right, in this future because of technology. So that's interesting to think about her, you know, as an Afrofuturist also, which is so coming to appreciation right now. There's now a permanent Afrofuturist room at the Metropolitan Museum of Art that just opened, that the production designer of Black Panther created. So, I mean, I think there's this, you know, real sense that that kind of perspective, that kind of outsider perspective, you know, is really relevant right now.
And she was influenced, I think, you know, by, you know, bands like Funkadelic.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, right.
You know,
no, totally.
They had a big impact on.
Yeah, who were influenced by Sun Ra,
Yeah.
the original Afrofuturist. So it's all this, full circle. And and I mean, and she was so, I mean, germ-free adolescence. Like now parents are literally like giving their kids dirt. It's like, here, develop immunity, play in the dirt. We have to make sure.
Yeah.
So, I mean, even that, you know, came to fore, right? This idea that like, oh, we haven't been exposed to enough germs and we have to make sure we're exposed to germs.
Yeah. So, and I mean, especially now, you know, obviously with the pandemic, that song, I think, has taken on so much relevance, and that's quite scary, like quite spooky, that in fact, you know, how accurate those predictions are. You know, there's a line in the song is, you know, you may get to touch her if your gloves are sterilized, rinse your mouth with Listerine, blow disinfectant in her eyes. And I think that really kind of describes our current age.
Yes. Totally. Oh my God, what would she have made of it? And then, I mean, another thing is one thing I definitely wanted to touch base with you about is the theme of the spiritual journey, which I think is actually so interconnected when it comes to a lot of artists, and that artists are often seeking meaning and seeking alternative, right, perspectives and viewpoints, and often developing their own alternative perspective and viewpoints. And I'm always kind of surprised when people are surprised that artists like your mom go on spiritual journeys like this. I mean, it makes a lot of sense to me, being that she was such a seeker. And then also, one thing I also wanted to ask you about, which is interesting, is how much your film and her story kind of foregrounds, which I think is something that is in the subculture that hasn't been documented. And I know it was only for a period of time, but the kind of the Venn diagram of like punk rock and Krishna, if you will. Like, you know, I grew up in New York, where that was always, those connections were there. And so many people that were in the punk scene ended up in the Christian, you know, there was a lot of crossover in New York. So to me, it's not like a foreign idea. And I think you did a really good job of kind of mining, you know, that intersection, which I think is like, it's there, it's broader, right? But I don't see it represented a lot. I wanted to, you know, ask you, and also just thank you for the way you framed that journey so, you know, respectfully and so expansively, and didn't dismiss it. And we're real, you know, it was real about like, my mom was a seeker and this was part of her. Yeah. So could you expand on that a little bit and just talk about that? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that part of my mother's story is really also my story more than any, you know, more than anything else, because I was born within the Hare Krishna movement. Well, I was born just before my mother joined, but she joined when I was a small baby. So it was kind of all I knew in my early childhood. And the mother that I knew was, Maharani. That was her Hare Krishna name. Way before Poly Styrene, I was even aware of Poly Styrene. My mother's spiritual identity was much more prominent in my life. So it was really, really important for me to treat my mother's beliefs with respect. We didn't always share the same beliefs, but, I have so much respect for her, unshakable faith. Actually, especially towards the end of her life, it really gave her so much strength. And I didn't agree with everything that the Hare Krishnas believe in, and I've followed my own path, but I have so much respect for my mother's beliefs, and of course I've been influenced by those beliefs myself, in terms of my worldview, some of my ethics, of course, have been really influenced by that. And as you say, I think it shouldn't be surprising that someone who is so, just so creative, that is, it is unusual that they're not going to be asking questions, really the big questions about why are we here, where do we come from, where are we going, and those are the kinds of questions my mum was exploring. She was always exploring, even in the X-Ray Specs days, even on the album Gem for Adolescence. There's nothing overtly spiritual, let's say, but they're deeply philosophical. And I think that those philosophical yearnings led her to explore, a more spiritual path. But this was something she was motivated by from a very early age, since she was in her 3 or 4 years old. She was sort of thinking about these ideas.
Yeah, and just kind of really representing that notion of, like, whatever form it takes, of like another world is possible.
Yes.
And it just seemed, that was so much in the music, and just this response to this kind of increasingly consumeristic literally plasticine world, that we find ourselves in. And then that response, that incredible artistic response to that then led her on the spiritual journey. It just, and I think the film just really laid that out and clarified that and made sense of that beautifully. I think, for folks that maybe it didn't make sense.
Yeah.
For.
Yeah, and in fact, I mean, just the other day, someone sent me a message, after seeing the film, and said that they were now inspired to look into spirituality. And I think if anything would make my mum happy about the film, it would be that.
Yeah, no, totally. It's so interesting that you were saying you didn't have an idea of her as Poly. Like, when did that idea develop? Like, when did you become aware of her legendary status, I guess I should say?
Well, when I was a kid, I was aware, because people would say, they would be out in London, and people would sort of stop her and say hi. And the thing about my mum is that she had so many different identities. Identity is a big theme in her music, and obviously a lot of that is talking about her racial identity, being a mixed race woman in a very white world at the time. But she was also playing with identity. So many people knew her by different names, So there was like the Marion. My mother was born Marion. And so that was what everyone called her in the family. But then her friends at school called her Marie. And then of course, she had Poly Styrene. So some people call her Poly. And then some people would call her Maharani. That was her Hare Krishna name. So she had all these names. So I guess as a kid, it must have been a bit confusing, but at the same time, I just took it for granted, that some people would call my mum Marie, some people Polly, some people Maharani. And then, of course, for me, she was mum, So yeah, I remember people saying, "Hi, Polly," and, we love you and love your music. But that was a rare, that wasn't happening every day, because my mum was dressing in a sari in those days. She wasn't even really recognizable. You had to be a real fan, I think, to recognize that was Poly Styrene.
Right.
She'd grown her hair long. She looked completely different a whole look. So
You froze for a minute. I think we're okay now, though. Yeah. Yeah, we lost you for a minute, but I think we're good. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think I just didn't hear the last couple of things that you said, but I think you were talking about just, which makes sense. I mean, also she was so charismatic. There must have been all these different kind of communities and groups that you discovered that had a relationship to her. I would imagine there were all these different kinds of groups of people, right? In her life, throughout her life.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's so
many. And there were so many people, but I guess when you're a child, you just take it for granted. So it's not until I grew up that I really understood who was Poly Styrene,
right.
and all these different identities. It took me a long time to really just understand, the significance of it.
Yeah, and then how it impacted you, right? I mean, because it wasn't always easy. And I mean, I have to say, you must have like the most consolidated identity. Your mom would be so proud of you, it would seem to me, because you've been able to do your thing, be an artist, be an educator, do your own thing, and then just like be a mom to your mom almost, and be this incredible like keeper of her flame.
Yeah.
And just really do that in the most like honest but like loving and respectful but like clear-eyed way. And I mean, you must have done a lot of work on your identity, because you seem so consolidated and so secure in how to navigate all this, which I would think would be complicated.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's something I was born to do, and I've been doing since I was a child. I think when you have parents who are very creative, but also quite creative, people are quite difficult. Often they can be very challenging. And my mother suffered from mental health issues as well. She had bipolar disorder. So that really meant that from a very early age, I did have that sense of responsibility, towards my mother. And I was a bit like, the parent sometimes. But on the other hand, my mother was very strong. So she was this
I bet
she was a walking contradiction, because she was very, very, very strong, but also very vulnerable. And so that can be difficult to navigate when you're a child, because you're like, sometimes you've got this really strong role model, this stable figure who's not always there for you, who you can't always depend on or rely on. I think that could be probably really difficult for most kids, but it's one of those sink or swim kind of situations. And I do think that for me, it actually helped me to grow up early, and it gave me a lot of strength, and maturity. So I'm kind of grateful for the good and the bad.
Yeah, no, totally. And that, I mean, and the other point I was making was that it didn't keep you from becoming an artist, which is also amazing. It didn't dissuade you from your own creativity and your own expression. So, I mean, that's where I say you also are really strong, I think, most likely, as a person, that you were able to consolidate all of this and then continue to, I mean, I would imagine the work is continuing, right? In terms of honoring your mother, you're probably going to do more. And
it doesn't end, it's an ongoing, I'm an only child as well. So, it's something I'm always going to be doing. But like, one thing that my mother always recommended, that this was some advice, and I took it, was, before, doing anything creative, I should finish my education. So that's what, so I didn't, I took a long time actually to do music, my own music. I actually just, I went to university, and I really kind of focused on my studies. And then I got a band together in my mid-20s. So I didn't jump into it, like when I was a teenager, because my mum was always like, that was her regret, actually, that, it was amazing that she did everything so young, but she never really had anything to fall back on, and so that could be really difficult also financially as well, like it's hard to make a living as an artist. So she was always like, finish your education, have something to fall back on. So that's what I did. So I'm a teacher as well. I've always been teaching. I kind of, sometimes I don't have time to teach. Right now I don't have much time to teach, but I always go back to it. So I think I've been able to balance like a creative life with just a regular life, and I think that's been really, really good for me.
Do you teach music or?
No, English.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Well, that's fitting considering
Yeah.
your mom is such a great writer.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. I'm curious, like, was she aware of people like Alice Baggs, like like on the West Coast in LA, kind of a Chicana woman that was kind of doing a similar thing in LA at the same time? And it's just interesting to me that there were these women of color in the punk movement at that point in a way that I'm not sure ever existed again. And I just wanted to ask you about that. I wondered if that was something she ever talked to you about or you thought about. And I don't know, it seems like maybe it was open at the very beginning in a way that kind of it wasn't after that. And it's just interesting to me that such iconoclastic women were at the forefront at the beginning, really, in this way.
Yeah.
And I just wondered what you thought about that. And and women of color too. It's just fascinating. Yeah.
I mean, my mother spent a lot of time in the States, actually. So, she went to New York in the 70s with the band, and they had the residency at CBGB's. But after that, during the 80s and 90s, she made many trips back to the US, and she had a real fondness for the West Coast, especially, and yeah, she was able to connect with some artists and that kind of scene, but also on the East Coast, because in the early 90s you mentioned before the Krishna core, the hardcore kind of Washington DC, I think Boston, those kind.
Totally.
She definitely had she maintained contact and relationships with her fellow punks across the pond.
Yeah, no, the DC hardcore punk scene is that's a whole other, I mean, there's like a kind of cliche about it, but it's so true that people would these bands would do a show on Saturday night and they'd go start school at Harvard the next day. It was like this very weird, like preppy hardcore scene from like the hardcore band to Harvard, but very Georgetown. And that's a whole other, like in the US, all these hardcore scenes had their own, kind of culture. And I would imagine there was a lot of exposure to that for sure. So what is the response been to the film like? I mean, it must be kind of overwhelming, I would think, people's reactions. And
it's been great, just super positive reactions, and it seems like everyone really loves the film. So, I think that's all we could ask for, more than we could ask for. And it's really great to get, after so much hard work, and it took 5 years to make this film, so it's a big chunk of life. To get that kind of recognition is great, and it's not just for me, because there's a huge team behind this film. Obviously, Paul Sung, Zoe Howe, who I mentioned, but our producers, we also have an American producer, Matthew Silverman, and our producer Rebecca Mark Laws, and our editors, they do so much creatively.
Oh, yeah.
They very rarely get, the credit or any credit, which is such a shame, and so we just work with fantastic people. So the fact that we're starting to, get nominated, we've been nominated for some awards in the UK, and it's just great, after all the hard work to kind of get that recognition.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, editors are basically the unsung co-directors of documentaries.
Yeah,
They're
absolutely.
so important. And I worked several years for Albert Maysles, and I mean, they ended up ultimately, crediting their editors as their co-directors because they were
Yeah.
so critical to the success of their films. Documentary editors are absolutely phenomenal in the work that they do. How did Ruth Nega end up narrating it? That's
Yeah,
exciting. And then just like thinking about passing coming out now, it's like talk
I
about the
know.
layering, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting.
I mean, it's a funny story. So my cousin Solomon and we were in Soho one evening, and we literally just bumped into her
Oh,
on the
whoa.
yeah on the street. I think she was outside, and we'd had a couple of drinks, so we were like maybe a bit more friendly than we would normally be, and we just got chatting, and then we hit it off. We ended up having a drink together with Ruth, and then later, after maybe a month later, I was talking to Paul about how we were going to do the voice, my mum's voice. So we were like, okay, maybe I could do it, but then I'm kind of narrating the film, so that would be really confusing.
Yes.
And I already sound a bit like my mum. It would just be really
Yeah, you do.
confusing.
Yeah.
So we were like, no, we need to get an actor, someone who's trained, who can do it justice. And so Ruth was just the first person who came into my head, because she had told me that she was a huge fan of my mum's, and that my mum
Nice.
was really like, an inspiration for her. So it just made total sense that I would ask Ruth, and she I was just so grateful that she said yes.
And her acting chops are like, they're okay, they're not that. She's such an amazing actor. She's so phenomenally talented, and and that's so fitting. Yeah, and it was so cool to see, Nina Cherry talking about the influence, because I feel like so many people probably wouldn't have gotten into the business if it wasn't for Nina Cherry. So just this kindless, this each one teach one kind of endless cycle of these, iconoclastic, amazing women of color that have influenced each other and influenced the world. And that was really cool. And that totally made sense. And I was like, I hadn't really thought about that. Do you think that the New York stuff was kind of, because I mean, I was a little kid in New York at that time. It was pretty materialistic. I mean, do you think that that was part of why New York was just so kind of such a turnoff, and why it just really got under her skin, because that was a place where there was just so much consumerism, and it was so just kind of in that American way that's different maybe from the UK, the level of consumerism? And
it was then. That's the thing. Not now. The UK is now definitely one of the most consumerist places on earth. But then, yes, there was a noticeable.
New York was shocking in that way.
It was shocking. But it wasn't just, I think it was the combination of the consumerism, but also there was a very dark energy there that she felt, I think mainly on the punk scene, like
yes,
a lot of heavy drug taking, harder drugs than people were taking in London. I think it was all just a bit more innocent and youthful in London.
Interesting.
They were all kind of just these young kids, kind of very young kids. The worst they were doing is maybe some speed, and then they came to New York, and it was a bit more grown up, and just another level, I think, of
more of a business. Maybe more like the record industry kind of thing, the cocaine, the heroin, that kind of like sleazy record industry. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah,
and that would have been more infantile. That would have been more in its infancy in the UK at that point, because you had the Sex Pistols, but everything hadn't kind of blown up in the way. That's also incredible. Like, dude, how many like origins? It's just insane how many origin stories there are around somebody seeing the Sex Pistols for the first time. It's just like, it's wild. I mean, it's amazing. That must have been quite a tour when they first did that tour. I mean, it just seems like an entire generation was ignited by that.
Yeah.
Including your mom.
I think it was, I would say my mum was always a fan of the Sex Pistols, and you know, my mother was not one to be a fan of anyone.
Yeah.
But the Pistols, she had a lot of respect for. I think just because they were the first, at least in the UK, to do what they were doing.
Yeah, I mean, it seems different, but it's not, right? Because in both cases, it's about pointing out when the shit stinks.
Yeah.
In both cases, it's about pointing out, like, hey, this system, this whole system that we're operating within, it doesn't work. It's messed up, and we're going to call it out. And I think, you know, in that sense, there's a lot of crossover between X-Ray Spec and the Sex Pistols. And yeah, it's interesting. And that's punk, right? I mean, that's what's so great about punk.
Yeah.
Rock.
And I mean, I don't, obviously I'm team X-Ray Specs.
Yeah.
But I would say that, you know, my mother was inspired by their energy and their attitude. But I think musically and lyrically, X-Ray Specs, they surpassed that.
No, it's more sophisticated, shall we say, is the diplomatic way. And yeah, we haven't even talked about and we have to wrap up soon, but yeah, the style stuff. I mean, that is, I mean, and maybe there's some projects you have in the works around that, but like that's, sartorially, her influence is going to continue. So, I mean, that was so, and like everybody's dressing like that now, right? Like literally that is kind of, you know, the Gen Z thrift store, blah, blah, blah kind of look that she had, you know, 40 plus years ago is just so mainstream now. But it was really unusual then. It was very unusual. Yeah.
It was very, very unusual, and it wasn't like trendy, you know.
No. No, but it was so amazing. I mean, oh my God. Yeah. And yeah, it's like it's so in style now, so many years later. So so we're going to wrap things up. What is next for Celeste Bell? Please tell us, what are you up to? What's next for you?
Yeah, well, I'm just, you know, working on some new film ideas. So hopefully these will materialize into films. One is alongside Vivian Goldman, who she's actually New York based. She's a professor of punk at NYU, and she wrote
I've heard of her. Yeah.
She wrote a book called Revenge of the She-Punks, which is a fantastic book.
Nice.
So looking to bring in that to the screen and big screen. And then I want to sort of I'm developing a film idea about the Hare Krishna movement. So and looking at the history of the movement and the kids who grew up in that. So that's kind of my next big project. I see that taking many years to do because it's quite huge, you know, really huge story. But yeah, those are the two projects I'm sort of working on at the moment.
Well, your first outing as a filmmaker is like you knocked it out the park. So I'm excited to see what comes next. And thank you. And please keep making films. And I'm really excited, you know, to see what comes next for you. And thank you so much for joining us. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Thanks, Celeste.